Hello, folks. Looks like we've got we have a good crowd already. I think for tonight we had something on the agenda around discussing the scaling of metrics more. It looks like Paul, who I thought was going to be able to make it, not be able to make it tonight. But if there are other folks who around would like to talk about those topics or anything else, we can go ahead. Matt, I think you had some thoughts on this topic. What do you think? Do you want to? Was there some aspects of it that you wanted to bring up?
Which can you restate the topic? Are you talking about the metric stuff?
Yeah, the metric stuff.
Well, there's a bunch of people here that have a conversation about that. But following up on the previous month CDM, obviously I'm really a little confused what's going on. From the Red Hat side, Paul Kusner was involved, and also some folks working with him. A couple of folks of those are here, Van Thakar and others. But we believed that I believed, and Casey believed, but Casey's not able to be here. That we're kind of focused on a corner of it, but with two parts. One, we want to be able to widen the interface to get alerts and parametric counters out of RHW, and we think I'm not quite sure about the alerts, but something similar about counter information is, as I understand it, something that CephFS and RBD also need to do. So there's a kind of those are. I thought we kind of had a conversation going last month that we were making that there were a few different themes, and there's a bunch of themes in this doc that people have been editing. I'm sorry that's not visible here. I mean, we can find a way to make that visible group because I think it's all upstream relevant stuff. But one theme was the Jason Tillman, I think, originated theme that we want, that there's some consensus for, that we needed to, in order to do various things, we many different counter-related topics or metrics-related topics need to change the topology of how metrics are collected. Most of us are focused on Prometheus, but there's been a kind of a counter thinking. I'm not sure how counter it is, but that was part of where we were. Most of us were talking about prototyping things. Paul's kind of said it's conflicting with what thinks the dashboard folks want to do, and I don't fully understand how it's conflicting. I don't understand which different details the dashboard folks are trying to pursue. So I'm kind of a little bit confused. There were kind of various. There were at least 3 or 4 different themes last month. There were themes about doing those things that I just described. There were also kind of quasi similar or quasi counter proposals. Scale up manager in different ways. There was a proposal to put counters into Rados using indexed storage. I think problematic aspects, but it was proposed. So I'm a little confused where we are.
Thanks. Well, I think that's a good summary of kind of what the discussion was last time and kind of what the different thoughts were at the time. I'm a little bit confused about the current state of things as well. I'm not sure precisely what folks are.
Well, another thing that's another one more thing that's in the document, whether or not we can rely on Prometheus as a primary endpoint, or a sink for we have to think about different stuff. That kind of feeds into that Ernesto has said, and also maybe a point that Patrick made last time. That we need something more general. But I'm afraid of that.
Okay, well, let's maybe try to summarize some of these things in the Etherpad that I just linked in the chat, so they're more accessible to everybody, and we can try to kind of share this a little bit more widely too. It looks like we have Avan here. Avan, maybe you have some context for what you've been thinking about or working on so far.
Hi. Yeah, well, basically, the idea came up with the thing is basically the MGR collecting all the metrics and send to the MGR Prometheus. So the problem first came up with the Prometheus model itself because at scale it's hard to scrape all these metrics with like around 10,000 OSDs. So is to somehow reduce those metrics or what other way we found is
just to clarify, are you saying that it's a problem for the Prometheus system, even scaled out
yes,
to scrape that many things?
yeah. Thing is
Okay.
the actual problem which we found out is not only applies to the Prometheus. That's why we are even planning to solve it at the lower level. I mean the C++ code itself, because the thing is MGR is collecting too many metrics right now and updating those according to the MGR stats period, which is mostly around 5 seconds or so. Yeah, it collects and it's sending to the.
We know that part, but I mean the proposal Jason had made was that we would invert that. Prometheus would scrape all the things. Then there was a middle proposal by Paul, basically that, or kind of Casey and Paul, that well there'd be these node local collectors that would sort of aggregate things, and then Prometheus would scrape those, or something like Prometheus would.
Yes. So yeah, coming to that, yeah, well, basically the plan is to have a per node exporter, which is basically what we are proposing right now is having a C++ daemon, which is doing this. So for now we have the admin socket files. I mean in the run Ceph on each host, at least with the Ceph ADM has, and we can do the same for the Rook as well because storing on per daemon basis. So it's all about persisting on the host. Yeah, that we can do. So from that we are basically trying to have a daemon which will gather all those socket files and we can have the output of all the perf terms per daemon basis and the thing is then we can just expose these as a HTTP endpoint. So basically that daemon is also responsible for starting the Prometheus server. So you can assume here that there is no Prometheus module, or you can say that Prometheus module is no more getting the perf counters or no get all perf counters calls. So basically, it will all those perf counters, and Prometheus can just scrape all those you can say the addresses of the servers or the daemons running on each host. So yeah, that's node exporter.
Okay, well that does sound familiar. That part does sound familiar, which is good. We'll recognize what that's about. There's a theme. There is a subtopic that there's a question I would ask. That we don't have to stick on it here, but what I think circling, RHW and I think RBD and CFS do want to widen interface of what counters are as well. I mean, we could use help from people that understand how Prometheus could consume it, right? But like, for example, the specific things we think we need to be able to do is in addition to the fixed array, sort of array of counters that we have, extensible, but an array of counters that are SLAT. We think we and the NCFS are going to need to be able to say, well, this volume, this array of counters, or along those lines, fixed number of volumes that are currently interesting these counters. And RHW has a similar need, and there is, and I think also alerts, temporally local information like status or something like that would be desirable to get to an endpoint. We aren't relying on log mining for that for particularly interesting information. Is that something that you guys know how to do? I was kind of relying on Paul's knowledge of Prometheus for how to do that. But other people might know it as well.
Yeah, the thing is, the issue comes in as soon as you have this the Python bindings. Basically, the locking or the GIL, you can say. So, to avoid those things, we That's why we propose this for that Prometheus no need to depend on any modules or the MDR modules to get those perf counters. We can have the daemon itself at the C++ level doing that.
Oh, I think I get that part, but I mean, I'm just saying if Nodex, let's propose. I mean, I don't know if other people are objecting, but let's say that we all accepted the node exporter idea as cogent. The only point I was raising is right now perf counters are a thing that Ceph, legacy Ceph concept. They're an array of named slots in an array. We'd want to be able to widen that somehow so that we can send a bit more data, more essentially. I used to call it sparse data, but we might have tens of thousands of buckets in an environment, but for some subset of those, we'd like to be able to send the activity on those buckets, or you might have those buckets might be replicating right now, or they might be ingesting right now, and we would like that to be visible to monitoring. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So does this matrix layer require the CLI, or are those you are expecting to be sent to the Prometheus itself?
I have always assumed to Prometheus so that it can be packaged up in whatever form, like graphing or. But there might be other ways to do it. But that's how I would not assume CLI.
Yeah, because for the Prometheus, we have thought that this could work as a POC. What we are proposing but yeah, for the modules which still require the CLI commands to run, we need to still send.
Oh, sure. I get that.
Yeah.
But for this additional stuff, there wouldn't be. There's nothing. Well, for one thing, in terms of RBD and maybe other stuff, there actually is this backward compatible angle. I understand that, but RCW doesn't really have. Right, even if it did, any new interfaces we'd be proposing wouldn't have to be backward compatible, right? So whatever the CLI and manager is doing best, it needs to do what it used to do.
Yeah, there are some purposes that we use the existing metrics in the manager for which you still want to use the metrics. For example, like telemetry, we've just added a number of those metrics to the performance panel. But that's kind of a once per day thing. It doesn't need to be collected every 60 seconds or whatever that period is to do that.
I just meant that if I don't know if anyone from RBD or Gregory or someone is here, Greg is here. Like let's say we had replication counters per volume, or you had replication counters per bucket or something, or top 10 buckets, or strain version of that. That I wouldn't propose that. I don't know of a reason why that would have to be available in a CLI or in a legacy interface and manager. If that only showed up in a new substrate, that would be okay. For us. Greg, you can.
Yeah, I imagine that for at least RBD, I think that's true. I mean, the point of these kinds of metrics is to be able to look at them through some sort of metric system, which could be Prometheus, it could be potentially something else. I'm not sure exactly how generic that sort of interface is, how generalizable just to different sorts of monitoring tools.
Yeah, I'm not either. I learned from people that like Jason and Paul, but I didn't really understand all the details. That Prometheus in particular had data structures data types that they comprehended something like what I've been calling a parametric counter. It could do that, and it knew how to handle sparse data coming up. But I don't know what other systems have. I mean, I would assume that there's some commonality, but I just don't know the other systems very well at all, and I didn't know Prometheus that well either.
Sorry, folks. I heard Matt ask me a question, and then my phone stopped being in the meeting, and I don't know if anything's happened since then.
Well, the question was, well, do you know what the question? The question was just about whether, like RBD and CephFS, whether like they also we have similar to you. I think you guys similar to RHW have a concept that you would like to see, like metrics for some subset of active volumes or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Because we have that.
I haven't followed this super closely, but we do have existing tools that we would like to be able to keep consuming that data, like the FS top and RBD top utilities. Seem like a place where people, I mean, maybe we have another idea, but those seem like places that people would expect to be able to see replication metrics.
Well, it does make sense, but we're hitting scaling limits of those channels.
Yeah.
Is it possible that they could be replumbed so that if you had like a scaled out, like if let's say you had, let's say Prometheus or some other scaled out time series database was where the data is, and there was some system for getting it, like a Prometheus server. Is it possible that even that the command line tools could be replumbed so that they fetched it from there?
I mean, maybe. I haven't really thought about it. We discussed it briefly internally for downstream reasons, how we might design the replication metrics. And at that time, we were sort of like, well, either we can do it on demand per volume, like for a volume, and we would probably just hack something together with Watch Notify in that case, where we like go ask it, or we do something that's sort of like time lapsed and just, things send in updates and we show the most recent status we have from any given thing, the way that we work PG stats right now. But it is not top of my mind right now, given the other projects we've been working on and how important this one is to us in that status.
Can't argue with that. Yeah. But from an RGB perspective, it's not our top thing either. Yeah. Except it's a thing that people have been asking us for 5 years to do. Probably not going away. So I'm trying to make a good faith effort to get something on the road.
Yeah.
Would this be a good candidate for a Summer of Code thing, or we've got some of those coming up, haven't we?
Well, sure. And I've got 2 interns who I can donate to helping with it, and there's other people too who can help do prototyping work. So yeah, if we can come up with proposals or proposed architectures and things to experiment with or attempt to implement, we can find a variety of ways to resource it.
It sounds like we may need to talk to the folks who know more about Prometheus and other monitoring systems to understand what is feasible there.
Well, Paul Kushner seems to know a lot about that, and so I'm not sure quite what has happened there. He's convinced that he's kind of stepping on toes or not able to keep track of what the dashboard is doing. So it feels like we kind of really unfortunate people couldn't come together here and talk it out. Kind of need, I think, to do that. I don't know if I think so. It seems like there's just a lot of crosstalk.
Yeah.
Could I?
Well, go ahead, Brad.
I was just going to propose the standard proposal of drafting an email to the dev list and maybe loop in the people that you see as crucial and see what sort of feedback we can get from that. Maybe link to the pad that Josh just created as well.
And in fact, there's this Google Doc that wrote that could easily be turned into the basis of such an email. It should be, because it's full of detail. It's all upstream stuff. I don't understand why it can't be shared anyway.
Awesome.
Yes, maybe that is next a good avenue for it, since the crosses time zones much more easily there with asynchronous communication. Anything else about this that we want to talk about right now?
Yeah, well, basically the metrics only per OSD is like around 172 metrics being sent. With
But I think I
or
missed
with
the first part of
greater
what you
than
were
equal
saying.
to I mean, there are around 172 metrics being sent per OSD D1. Yeah, and the thing is, they are all with the prior greater than equal to 5. So, are they really needed or used, or and those if this prior can be increased or some of the metrics can be reduced?
So if I'm understanding your question, you're asking those reporting lots of metrics right now are all of them necessary to be reported in monitoring systems?
Yes.
I think I had raised the same question with Paul at one time when he was talking about some of these bottlenecks, and I definitely would like to see which metrics those are and how they are being used at this point. And if there is, there is scope for reducing them, we'd be happy to do that. If nobody's looking at it, there's no point capturing it. But longer term, we do need some more solid solution, right? We might just scale up to those many meaningful metrics at some point. As a short-term solution, we can definitely look at which of those are actually useful. But longer term, 170 shouldn't be a problem, I guess.
Are some of them summarizable inside of the daemon too? So the time series, we're just going to zoom out basically and.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the sort of stuff, it's almost like going ground up, right? Over the period, I know that, we needed something somewhere, so we've tried to fit into the right priority to get them in. But over time, I understand that this has been happening a lot. So maybe some of them are not so useful, and some of them, as you said, can be summarized. So I'm happy to, drive that effort if somebody shows me exactly what those metrics are.
That sounds like that'd be really helpful. We do some of that in RGB already, and we'd like to reduce the amount of high frequency data that's just streaming out of things and turn it into something granular, probably. And I found it pretty compelling, that the idea that if we just push them to this node local thing, and it even summarizes things, and we can make it less costly for still to get to collect snapshots of that within 10-minute, 20-minute, whatever basis, then it becomes pretty cheap to do. Time series databases. Anyway, I'm happy. I'm happy to hear that things aren't as far. that the node exporter idea is still in play. I'll talk with you, Josh. I mean, we can figure, or anybody who knows, or maybe Paul, whoever's looped in that can turn Paul's talk into an email with maybe a summary of what happened here. That'd be good. That'd be a good start.
Yeah, that sounds good, Ben. I tried to take some notes during the discussion in the Etherpad there, so feel free to add more to that too. And maybe if you want to start the email to the list,
I'll do it.
That'd be great. Thanks.
I want to check in with Paul, so sometime tomorrow I'll send something around that's.
Sure. All right. Are there any other topics that folks want to discuss today?
I wanted to discuss a topic from centralized logging perspective. I mean, even in upstream, which solution do we? I was having a discussion with Ernesto and Ashish on a separate private thread, and Ashish has recently submitted PR for incorporating a Loki as for a centralized logging solution, but we are exploring it. Three different centralized logging solutions, which is a Greylog. I think, if I remember, and I've experimented, that we have a native built-in support for Greylog already in Ceph.
Yep.
And the other logging stack that we are certainly exploring and more experimenting with is a Loki and Elasticsearch. So we would certainly like to get more idea that which one is the best. And I mean, if any users are also using Elasticsearch, Loki, or any of external logging stacks on their own, I would certainly bring this up again in the user plus dev monthly meeting, the next one. But I wanted to get a feedback from everyone here in the CDM to get a thought process started, and which one could be best and helpful solution for us, because moving forward, just wanted to get a rough idea and thoughts on that, because I think if multiple clusters are involved, if multiple management of multiple clusters are even involved, centralized logging can play a very huge important part and help in the debugging of situations and help in troubleshooting of issues.
So I guess I would start with, like, what are the goals of the system, and do we need to pick a particular one, or are they generic enough that we can integrate with whatever centralized logging system folks want to use?
So currently, we can integrate with any of the centralized logging solution that users want. It's as per their choice, but from Ceph perspective, what would be recommend as the best and the standard one? Every centralized logging solution has some pros and cons on their own. We are even coming up with that list, and because, for example, for Greylog, we'll have to configure inputs forcefully on our own. It doesn't have any dynamic way of I'll say picking up those logs. So we have to tell Greylog that there's a just a second. I will share one limitation of Greylog. I have it noted in the POC doc. Yes, meanwhile, I'm looking for the specifics. And definitely, there are certain drawbacks of each and every centralized logging solution. But out of the best, Elasticsearch provides a lot of customization and a better visualization, whereas Loki is much more simpler in its own, and can be easily integrated with the native Grafana interface that we are using for our dashboard. Avan, I think you have worked on the centralized logging part as well, right? Along with Ashish and tried Loki.
Prompton and Loki was the one responsible for the basically. I can share the PR link.
Yeah, sure, that would be great. Or one of the main problems I noticed with Greylog was that we have to create or configure inputs before ingesting data. But if we want to push logs to a centralized location, let's say from multiple random clusters, it's uh, difficult or pain point to differentiate them. So we would need to consider some metadata uh, to identify them individually. I mean, Greylog is more static. We would need to, if we want to differentiate between multiple clusters, we will need to come up with some metadata identifiers in order to make sure that we can differentiate between them. It's all UDP based, basically. But that's one of the major problems that I noticed with Greylog.
So looking at this PR, it looks like it's focusing on Loki and Promtail. I'm not really familiar with these centralized logging systems myself very much. Can you like elaborate a bit on where they would be storing the logs, how they would be deployed? Looks like this is kind of integrating with Ceph ADM.
The thing is, it's starting basically two containers, the Loki and the Promtail ones. Promtail is the one to fetch the logs from under the, I guess, Ceph ADM stores under the each containers. So under the FSIDs. So it's like a well-lived Ceph and the corresponding FSIDs. It stores the logs the daemon logs. So that's where the Promtail is looking for. You can look at the YAML as well for the Promtail, and it's trying to on that. So basically, I'm not responsible for fetching those logs and expose it, on the HTTP server. All you need to do is just in the recording.
You were breaking up a little bit there, Ivan, but I think I got the idea from looking at the PR a little bit, and what you were saying that Promtail is effectively looking at updates to the local log files and exposing those through HTTP, and then Loki is scraping those and storing those in its own local database.
Yeah, basically, yeah, the thing is in this line, so Loki doesn't have to pull it. It's like a push-based strategy. So yeah, the prompt pushes it to this, yeah, to the client host, and that is basically the just need the Loki container to start, and that's all.
I see. But it's pushing to everything, pushing to a central Loki instance.
And I can share a brief about the Elasticsearch architecture as well. Can I share my screen just to share a quick overview of the architecture?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this Google Doc visible?
Yeah.
So basically, if we are using Elasticsearch and Logstash, there would be a need to run the beats daemon on every node from which we are trying to ship and collect logs, and that logs would be sent to a centralized logging server or Elasticsearch server, and then Kibana can be used to visualize that just from one cluster perspective, but we can have multiple clusters as well. We just have to send a metadata field, and there's a huge customization that can be done, and we can display these logs very easily in a nice way. Normally, in a Pacific or in a Pacific environment, every log we can just tell beats to a certain directory locations. It would send all the log files to the Elasticsearch server to visualize it. One of the initial problems I noticed was that basically it was flooding Verilog messages. So I had to modify the unit file, because from a performance perspective, I thought even if it's a small 3 or 4 node cluster, we were getting like 20 GB of logs being flooded every day. And that was a normal debug level. So this had to be done. Just one of the initial problems that I noticed, but the overall architecture looks like that. Yeah. So that was much of it from Elasticsearch perspective. Well, to share a brief idea, I'd like to get the discussion started and have our recommendations. I mean, what would be the best one which could be suited for Ceph, or if anyone is actually using any, or has tried any, would be great to have the opinion as well regarding the same.
Yeah, this might be an interesting question to ask on the Ceph users list as well. Might get some better feedback from folks who have been using these systems in the past. And clearly Graylog was used by someone, and since someone went to the trouble of integrating it with the existing Ceph logging infrastructure already, I'm sure other folks have probably been using the ELK stack and others, but I haven't really heard much about the pros and cons of each myself. So I think it'll be interesting to get more user feedback there. I'm not sure if we want to necessarily make say that one is particularly recommended or the others, but we help to understand kind of what use cases they can each serve, and what kind of role they could play.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. I know the Greylog folks. There's been the Greylog stuff has been around for a while, and there's people using it, but I don't know much about it. Especially how it deals with compression.
Yeah, I guess for each of these things, I'm curious, like how, like I know Elasticsearch has pretty advanced like query capabilities. There's a similar kinds of capabilities exist in Loki and Greylog, or how do you then deal with like the volume of logs, which could be potentially quite high.
Yeah, certainly. So I'll work with Ashish, and we would send out an email to both the dev list and the user list to get more feedback across the wider audience as well regarding the same. That will be useful and helpful in understanding if anybody is currently using any solution at the moment that we are unaware of.
Yeah, there could maybe even, like you said, other solutions out there too. Yeah, I think this is pretty interesting because it is kind of difficult to debug clusters when you have logs scattered across tens or hundreds of hosts and trying to correlate different events. If that was able to be searched and kind of indexed, and you could trace things through a system across multiple services, and that sounds pretty useful for debugging and performance analysis.
Yes, and even in terms of scale, right? If a centralized logging solution is configured, I mean, we can certainly debug things in a much more faster way as well, right?
Yeah, a lot of times, absolutely. I also wonder how much this kind of overlaps somewhat with the kind of tracing and observability type of work. Like a lot of our existing logging is geared more towards like developers, but I think we've talked about like the cluster log being more of a central store for human consumption and end user administrator understanding. I think a lot of the work around like observability tracing going to RDW is focused on that users as the audience as well. So maybe interesting to see like how useful these kind of low level logs are for folks in the field versus like the cluster log and potentially the tracing ideas that we've talked about and are implementing now.
It's definitely a concern that we really need conditional flows to reduce the volume.
Mm-hmm.
As you point out, Karav, I mean, you just get an astronomical quantity of mostly redundant data, but you still need the atomic bits to understand what's going on. Tracing gives you the possibility of really reducing it to specific flows and turning on traces or subtraces when the conditions are observed. That's what seems like the holy grail to me. I'm trying to find ways to get that into something we can use. But that doesn't mean people don't want. These log ideas aren't good. I mean, they're
yeah,
they're good. They're good. They're a missing link of some kind. I do think so.
Some of the things while I was checking in the past, I came across the ideas of connecting the traces with logs. So, like in particular, if we have a trace point, then it can maybe point us to where the logs for that particular process is situated in. So, like that might help reducing the overhead of processing the logs in a central location, which might be a problem if we are going to look into centralized tracing, since we have a large amount of log aggregation in Ceph. So yeah, maybe I think there, but I'm not familiar with anything that's happening for C++ right now.
Well, I've sort of I only I understand parts of that. I think part of the last part, I'm not sure if you're saying what I think you're saying, but like I've sort of, Adam and I at least, Adam Core, I have begun to accept that we might have to work on the Jaeger client. Yet I wouldn't be afraid of it, I guess. I mean, others, right? It seems like it needs some work, but it doesn't sound unreasonable to do if we can get a model that's valuable enough.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thanks, Josh, for creating the pad wood.
Sure, no problem. Just try to take a little bit of notes there, but I'm sure you guys can fill in more details and if you like.
Certainly, we'll do that.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like in general, like one of the advantages of these like ELK, Elasticsearch, Last and Kibana, and the Loki and Promtail approaches is that they don't need like tight integration with the system. They're pretty loosely coupled. They're just reading text files and sending them elsewhere essentially. Whereas Graylog is kind of more tightly integrated with the C++ code.
Yes, Graylog is more tightly integrated with our current code, and the other two don't need to be tightly coupled. It's just like from Elasticsearch point of view, just like we have a node exporter running on every node, right? We would have another daemon beats running on every node like that, and it can be done user level. So yeah, just that and some configurations that we have to do in order to send those to a centralized Elasticsearch logging server. And on that particular node or the centralized logging server, some patterns we can definitely, from a visualization perspective, we can configure even patterns as well. So I'm exploring that as well. If we notice a certain amount of patterns, there's an triggering alert mechanism as well. So yeah, I'm exploring around the conditions if we hit error based on, if we are able to identify based on a pattern that we can hit a alert, that would be useful or that would be alarming for users. I mean, that would definitely be a huge advantage.
Yeah, I think for alerting, I'd be kind of hesitant to add it more on top of the existing logging infrastructure, and like anything that we could identify there, in theory, we should be able to surface more directly as like a health error in Ceph. I think if we add too much more, like trying to interpret the logs, it's easy to kind of get a mismatch of understanding of the health of the system if you're trying to interpret it at more than one level. It can certainly be valuable for things that maybe in a short term, where if it's something that's like maybe harder to actually add a warning about it into Ceph itself. But I think longer term, we should try to centralize those kinds of warnings into the Ceph health system and not try to kind of bolt them on top. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely understood.
Matt, if you're saying something, I think you're muted.
No, I'm just thinking aloud in a pointless, disconnected way.
Well, now we can hear you thinking if you like.
Yeah, I'm thinking of centralized logging as an advantage for multi-site as well. I mean, because we have, I mean,
well, like I said, it has an advantage. We should have more conversations. I think conditional tracing is multi-site. So we've got the idea of serializing traces. Got a prototype that does multi-part uploads because they have like a series of transactions that can then recover, and we have there's an idea of doing something similar. Parts of traces could be serialized and actually in the logs, meaning in the replication logs, and then we can recover them to build span, to export spans later. But you could do this with the logging system too. There's no reason you couldn't. But right now, the logging system switches are fairly fine-grained, but they could be more so. But even no matter how much you do with the config parameters, you still have a lot of unrelated stuff flowing through. What interests me is graphs. If a set of conditions come in and we're sampling them, and we see that we're looking for a particular thing, like we're looking for operations on a particular bucket that have a particular signature, and that's where we know we have that. Sometimes those are the transactions that fail, or those are the transactions that lead to a corrupted index. We could progressively narrow down condition, and when we see it, start injecting traces. That's where the new idea, and it's sort of. I've talked to people about. I've asked people to think about Dtrace too as an example. You have the trace points, but the trace points become strictly more powerful if you have more intelligent ways of consuming the information you want and ignoring the information you don't want.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's absolutely necessary for a system like Ceph, where you potentially doing hundreds of thousands of transactions on a single node, and you really need to have that kind of fine-grained filtering to be able to get what meaningful correlation you can out of it.
So that's what excites me, and I think that the fact that the Jaeger system is we've had various trace point-based systems in the past that we've experimented with. One of the things on the front side, we had a pretty good one in Zipkin, but where Zipkin fell over for us, and I think for Ceph, is that it didn't have good collectors. Really broken database for collecting traces, and even though the idea was good, and it was all written in 40,000 lines of Scala or something, it was unreasonable and written storing out of Cassandra, and we didn't have anything like the resources we would have needed to sort of debug that. I'm really excited by the fact that Jaeger seems to have a solid set of infrastructure for collecting things. But also, even our logs could do it if we have a bunch of the trace, send them sort of wherever we want.
Yeah, potentially we could have much more fine-grained ways of turning things on, like you suggest, around like a per bucket or per image or per a file system, or some kind of much more user like a based filtering rather than per section of code that the logging happens to live in.
Exactly. As we go forward, that might be a way to really dramatically reduce the. It means you don't have. It takes away something that logs have. Logs have a. You have logging is that at a certain level you've collected everything, so you can then mine it, mine the past for what happened. The amount of data required to do that is immense.
Yeah, at that point, we would need to be sure that we have the right amount of logs and data ingested in place perfectly.
But when you look at how debugging works in reality, we're not able to. We're usually not, unless we're collecting core files, which is even more immense. there's still some condition too that gates that, right? It crashed the machine, or we triggered the core. So we must have figured out that we wanted to, or else it blew up. And so even that, so that's conditional too. But in debugging, something went wrong, and they reported it, and we're coming in and trying to fix it. We're usually going to have to reproduce it. If we can reproduce it in field, we've reduced a bunch of steps, or even reduced impossible steps. If it can take weeks to get a reproducer, it might never get it.
Yeah, and being able to filter out the debugging to much more fine-grained level would certainly help with that being even feasible in a production environment. Because today, a lot of places, if you're turning on the level of debugging you need to really diagnose something, it might be too much to really leave on for any sustained period of time.
I think in terms of logging a certain, is it a good idea to put certain conditions in the code where debugging can, if we notice some events, debugging can be turned on automatically at the daemon level for a certain time, being based on a certain condition, and then it can be, when the situation, as soon as it satisfies that condition, it dumps some debug 20 or level log, and certainly came back to normal.
Yeah, I think that's a conversion. I think it's the same idea. It's just with different outputs and different trace points. Our log points are analogous to trace points in that scenario. But yeah, we could look at as we work on this, we could try to unify. If there's interest in the code base to do that.
Because, yeah, I think every time a user won't have all the debug logging that we want. Certainly, normal logs should indicate something, but in such certain situations, we are in a need of higher debug levels. But if the situation is not reproducible, then, and if that data is not captured, then yeah, we have to try and repeat.
Yeah, it's another thing that we could potentially do more of. It like today we have separate levels of logging in memory versus what's going to disk, and in some exceptional cases, when we run into some problem, we might be able to do more of like dumping what's in our in-memory version of logs, which is more verbose and has more information that we wouldn't normally be storing. Kind of a baby step to get a little more detail about a problem.
I actually don't recognize that. What is the in-memory versus the?
There's two levels of logging for the debug, the logging in Ceph, right? There's the level that's going to the log file, and there's the level that's being stored in memory, which today is only dumped by admin command or when the system crashes.
Interesting. I always end up using the materialized forms. So, yeah, I guess I remember this from long ago, but I've forgotten how to even use it.
Yeah, it's not very commonly used. I mean, you specify it by saying like debug cool. ms equals like 1/5.
/5.
Okay. 5 is that.
Okay, so it's the slash second counter that gives you. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, we thought that the experimentation we would like to do. I mean, we were trying to put Lua scripting into things, and that was already a precedent in Ceph. If you have the ability to do some dynamic code, then you can inject new conditions at various points, and that might be a way to make it very flexible. I mean, it has some scary aspects, but I sort of feel like the complexity of some of the debugging scenarios we get pulled into, makes it interesting, just like it became for Dtrace.
Yeah. And like you're saying about your client, even for the tracing level stuff, I think we probably wouldn't need to do significant modification to make that level of sampling and filtering possible there.
Yeah, or at least fast. I mean, it might be the case that it might be the case that this is that could be true too. I would have thought, I guessed that that's more like a sink, and some sort of layer above it decides what gets there. But it could be both. But it is the case that like we looked at Zipkin and LTTNG and other stuff, the trace points, and well, other things before that, K probes and whatnot. But Jaeger tracing in the C++ environment at least isn't exactly cheap. It doesn't seem like it's really been thought through completely.
Yeah. It's not designed for the same kind of super fast local tracing.
But it can be worked on as an exterior tracing protocol for vectoring stuff to somewhere. We can be compatible with that.
Sure. Are you familiar with like Dtrace and how it does its dynamic filtering?
Well, yeah, to some extent. I mean, Dtrace was the precursor to LTTNG essentially in the open source, but so they invented CTF. So it has low cost trace points that generate CTF events. Yeah, but then the Dtrace engine is a scripting language, and you attach it to a group of trace points. So we could think of it as like equivalent to like having a conditional injector into Jaeger.
Mm-hmm.
But that scripting capability was powerful enough and fast enough. It used clever tricks, like it had data types that like did aggregates. You could create a variable that was like a summary and things like that, and you could conditionally sample something that was happening thousands of times a second and get some value out of it, and then you could write like an awk script around it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was built. But that was just sort of sugar on top of trace points.
Yeah, super low level trace points that you could kind of already had well defined parameters, I guess, because of the CTF format and fixed.
But the power was that you could like correlate this and that and start up things, and I saw the things that you could do with it were mind-boggling. Bad that has not been a standard way of doing things.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very interesting, but yeah, maybe something to think about in the future once we have tracing more in place. And
well, yeah, exactly. So I mean, what RGB is trying to do is get tracing in complicated workflow, like multi-site would be the big one. So it forces us to solve some distributed tracing and maybe some freeze thaw things, and then we've learned this year that we want to try to get some conditional in as well. So if we could figure out, okay, we're looking for various events happen, then it turns on trace flows, then figure out what to do with them. I mean, I think I think it's tractable, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're constraining the types of conditionals and not trying to make a generic scripting engine that's super fast and all that.
Yeah, exactly. That's crazy. Yeah, exactly. So although that was a tour de force when they did it, when they did it, but yeah, I've not proposed that. I'm saying let's use Jaeger. Let's pump it to Jaeger.
Sure. Right. Well, that was an interesting discussion and a version around trace points and debugging and filtering as well. Ron, is there anything else you wanted to talk about with regard to centralized logging?
Nothing further at the moment, but yeah, this was really an interesting discussion. Yeah, and we'll move forward to discuss this in further forums and mailing lists as discussed.
Cool. Sounds good. Any other topics? All right, guess not. Well, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your night or day, and see you next month.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.